2 years ago when I left cinema and took up Blender, the hardest part was leaving behind Redshift. Now I love Blender, and you won't catch any blasphemy from me, but I'm also a realist, and I do miss a render engine that looks as good as Redshift or even Arnold. Now Cycles is fine, it works fine, but it can take a lot of effort to get production quality results. So as the title of this video suggests, today I'm going to be teaching you how to gently brute force your way into better renders. Now as much as I love getting nerdy and technical, there are about 8 billion videos out there about the settings and optimizations and all that jazz, and they're about as helpful as they are boring, so we're not going to do that today. Today we're going over 3 easy actions you can take to bend Cycles to your will and finesse the hot garbage that it spits out by default. Let's get to it. My name is Elijah Sheffield. I go by Sweet Boy Motion in the public sphere. I make content geared towards people learning or using Blender to create stylized art, so be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any of my ramblings and musings. The first tip we'll explore today, always use HDRIs. Now to seasoned vets, this seems like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised how many people are still using the default gray world. Lights in Blender are fine. I have a personal vendetta against them, but they work alright. However, without an HDRI, the default world, even with a fancy lighting setup, creates really bland renders with poor photo accuracy. But Cycles loves HDRIs. It will literally mean the difference between a bad render and a great render. The way light wraps and bounces with an HDRI is exponentially better than anything you'll get trying to chase a scene with area lights or, heaven forbid, a sun. If you're using a sun, stop. Now for those unfamiliar with setting up and controlling HDRIs, let's hop into Blender and set one up. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is make sure we have a shader editor tab open. We can do that by going up to the top left of any one of these pages and just making sure that we're in shader editor like that. The next thing we need to do is go from object mode to world mode. And now by default, we have this gray world. This is what it looks like in the render preview down here. And just by default, it's gray and the strength is set to 1. So what we want to do is replace this background with an HDRI. I'm going to hit Shift A and look up environment texture. And I'm just going to click to confirm it. And now I'm going to plug it in color to color, just like that. And you'll see it's bright pink, which is not what we want. So before we add our texture in, let's hit Control T. If we have Node Wrangler enabled. If you don't, you can hit Command comma or go up to Edit Preferences and go down to Add-ons and make sure that it's included. Once we have our environment texture mapped, we can click Open and navigate to where we have an HDRI downloaded. I'm using some assets that I pulled from Grayscale Gorilla. I found their HDRs work really, really great. So I'm going to take this Sky HDRI that I have and I'm going to double click it and load it up in there. And immediately, straight out of the box, we get this beautiful lighting setup and it took almost no effort at all. Using HDRIs alone can enhance the quality of your render by a lot, and put you one step closer to strangling Cycles into a production quality engine. And for tip number 2, we're going to render big and sample low. The denoiser is such a great feature of Cycles, especially with how much you can control it. The problem is, it can definitely get carried away and destroy your renders. You see, the denoiser wants to eat all of the noisy imperfections of your render, and that noise is caused by low lighting samples. So if you render at lower samples, you might get a faster render, but you also get a lot of noise in your render, so the denoiser comes in and inadvertently eats up all the detail. So you have a fast render with no noise, but the finer points of your textures are lost to the insatiability of the denoiser. You end up with really fuzzy details, cloudy shadows, and chattery renders. So it becomes a bit of a dance. You sample low enough for it to be fast, but high enough to combat the heavy noise. It can be insanely annoying to balance. So to sidestep that headache, we're just going to go ahead and increase the size of our render. A larger size means more pixels. So we can increase our render anywhere from 150 to 200%. This bump and scale will give you the chance to lower your sampling, allowing your renders to go faster. And the larger image size means that the denoiser has less of a chance to chew it up and make it look ugly. And now when you bring it into something like Premiere or After Effects, you can drop it back down to its 1x size and it preserves a lot of the details. For whatever reason, rendering at double the size but a fraction of the samples renders much faster than at size with higher samples. And truthfully, the difference in quality is negligible. Now, if you compare two stills, you might not see a huge difference, but if you look at an animation, the difference is monumental. Now here's the caveat to this tip. If you have a low lighting situation or a scene with a really high likelihood of noise, I'm thinking like volume scatter, lots of glass, that kind of stuff, you'll end up having to increase the sampling size to the point of diminishing return. So for example, if you have your sampling size set to something like 1024 to really combat some fireflies in your render, having it at 1.5 or 2x won't necessarily be faster than having it at size with 2048 renders, and you might get a better result. It's definitely worth experimenting with before you rip off a whole animation sequence, but in the majority of render situations, this helps tremendously. And for the third and final tip, bounce your light. It's easy to get trapped in a workflow of just throwing more lights at a scene, trying to get it to look brighter. But often that's overcorrecting, and you end up with weird shadows, longer render times, and a trashed out mess of a lighting setup. So instead, learn to harness the power of bounce cards and use indirect lights to correct those dark spots. So let's take a look at this scene that I've set up and correct the lighting situation using only bounce cards. Carrying on with our little dragon and knight scene here, I'm going to create a new collection and call this bounce cards. Once we create that, If we go up here to our little filter button and we drop that down, you'll see we have a bunch of restriction toggles up here. Let's make sure that this little ricochet arrow is ticked on so that we have the chance to turn that on and off with our collection. But before we turn that on, let's add a new plane. So I'm going to hit Shift A and go to my add menu and just add a plane. And now I can just move it to where I want it, and I'm just going to use this plane here to diffuse some of the light and use indirect light to bounce it back into the scene itself. So I can toggle that on and off, and you can see now it's kind of dark and there's not much fill lighting here. And now if I hit undo, bring it back into the scene, it starts to fill in some of those darker areas. But the problem is, as you can see in our camera, the plane is visible and we don't really want it to be visible. So if we go back up to our collection, we can click that ricochet button and it disappears from our render view. And we can actually take this a step further. If we take our bounce card and pull it up closer to the night, you can see we get shadows down here, which is not ideal because this isn't supposed to exist. And if we zoom in, we can also see on the armor there's getting some reflections from the bounce card itself. So let's go over to our object properties and we can drop down to visibility and let's just turn off some of the ray visibility. Let's go ahead and turn off everything but glossy and diffuse. And that really didn't affect much because diffuse and glossy are the two things that are being affected by the bounce card. So if we turn diffuse on and off, we can see that really affects the lighting situation. But if we turn glossy on and off, that affects it showing up in the reflection of the armor. So we don't want it to reflect in the armor because it's technically not supposed to be there. So let's be sure we tick off glossy. But now you'll see we still have a little bit of a light differential here. That's because it's bouncing the light and intersecting with this plane. So we can actually just scale this down a little bit and that goes away immediately, but doesn't really impact the lighting situation. And if we scale it out in the Y, we'll see it just diffuses it out more and kind of widens that bounce card just like it would in a practical setting. Now with a little bit of finessing, you can whip cycles into shape and create some really beautiful work. And you can't beat that price tag. Now, if you found this video useful and used any of these tips in your own masterpiece, be sure to post it on Instagram and tag me, sweetboy.motion, so I can feel bad about my own work. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. I'll be putting out content like this every week for an indefinite amount of time. And be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter, where I post breakdowns, behind the scenes, finished products, all kinds of stuff like that. Links are in the description below. Thanks so much for watching.